been Handler, Scott Handler.
I miss Scott Handler.
He's the best. Scott Handler, Arun, Jordan. All right, well, thank you for coming today. This is our 6th of 7 discussion groups on the topic of international trade in the 21st century. And I'm really excited about today's discussion with my friend Meghan Groob, who I had the pleasure of working with when Meghan was at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and she was our Director of Speechwriting and Deputy Director of Public Affairs. So just a reminder, we'll conclude our discussion group next Wednesday, same time, same place. It'll be our final session, and we'll talk about how trade agreements are enforced and what mechanisms a country or company has when they feel like a party is not honoring what they agree to as part of their agreement. So our guest is going to be John McInerney, who is currently of counsel at the Washington, D.C. office of the law firm of Mayer Brown, but prior to that had a long career in government service, including 17 years from 2000 to 2017. He was chief counsel for trade enforcement and compliance at the U.S. Department of Commerce. So Meghan is currently the editorial director at Gates Ventures. She previously worked at the U.S. Department of Commerce from October 2014 through January 2017, where she rose to serve as director of speechwriting and deputy director of public affairs. Additionally, Meghan served as a speechwriter for the 2016 Democratic National Convention and previously worked for 2 years as a media strategist at the ACLU's national headquarters in Washington, D.C. She has worked as a communications director both on political campaigns and on the Hill for a member of Congress. Meghan holds a BA in politics from New York University, and please join me in welcoming Meghan to the Dole Institute.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So thanks so much for being here, Meghan. And I just want to talk. So you majored in politics in college, so this is obviously a long-standing interest. So what was it that got you hooked on politics and public affairs?
Honestly, The West Wing.
Oh, The West Wing.
Yeah, The West Wing was on from about end of middle school through all of high school for me, and I watched it. I know this is the least inspiring, satisfying answer, but I watched it, and I looked at what Sam Seaborn did, and I was like, I want to be that. I didn't know I'm from Kentucky, so I'd never met anyone who worked in national politics. I had no connection to it at all, had absolutely no idea how you made that happen, but I looked at that and I was like, I want to be Rob Lowe's character. I don't know what I'm going to do. So then I knew, when I was getting to college, I was thinking about what I wanted to major in. I'd always loved writing, so I knew I wanted to do something with writing and something with politics. And so I studied politics and actually did a lot of creative writing classes, but they don't offer it as a major at NYU. So I went to college for that and tried to figure it out from there and kind of fell my way into it. Still had never met a speechwriter, professional speechwriter, probably until I was maybe 24, and by then I had already moved down the path of trying to make that my goal in life, and got pretty lucky with a couple different opportunities and fell my way into it.
Oh, that's so interesting. So. And what was it about, you talked about speechwriting, so I mean, you've been doing messaging and communications for large parts of your career, Capitol Hill, federal government, advocacy organizations. What was it about the messaging and communications aspect of that part of politics? What attracted you to messaging and communications?
I think I love the notion of advocating for something, and a lot of it comes from growing up in Kentucky. I grew up in a very conservative neighborhood, and I'm more progressive, and I had a lot of beliefs that at the time I was too young to know that they were political. I wouldn't have considered them political beliefs, but especially on social issues, I was much to the left of 95% of my classmates, and even as young as 6th and 7th grade, we would, people would kind of argue about it, and I would have to defend myself, and no one else would back me up because it was Kentucky, and there was no one else. There was no one else on my side. And so I think from a young age, I just really enjoyed debate and sort of, okay, how do you defend a position? How do you persuade other people to see the merit in that position? And then once I saw The West Wing and saw that was you can do this for a living, you can write. I also just loved writing in general, and I was like, I could combine my love of writing with my love of defending these political positions that as I got older I realized were in fact politics and not just, oh, I support a woman's right to choose or other social issues. As I got older, I realized I can combine these two things, and because I didn't know how to become a speechwriter, I thought communications seemed like a good route to follow. So I, right out of college, actually went to work for Al Gore's environmental nonprofit just as a press assistant. I just pulled media clips. I was not doing any writing or anything particularly exciting, just like mopping up press lists and pushing send on press releases, and because it just seemed like the road to speechwriting, and it was nice because it was along the lines of my messaging interests. But yeah, it's been a kind of long, winding road to here.
Yeah, and so I think this role of speechwriter is such an interesting role, and it's something that we don't really know a lot about, right? We see politicians give speeches all the time, but we don't really know about what is the speechwriting process and how does that speech get made. And I also think it's interesting because you're writing for different principals. They have a unique speaking style, delivery. Some have a different sense of humor than others. So what do you try and do when you're writing a speech to get to the place where you can write in the authentic voice of the person that you're writing for? How do you do that?
So I'd say it completely depends on the person you're writing for. So when I was writing for Penny Pritzker, the Secretary of Commerce, we both served, with her, she had given speeches before, and so I was able to go back and look at the speeches she'd given, but this was her first job that she'd ever had where she was expected to speak regularly, and she was very interested in developing her voice. So she really wanted to work on that and figure out, if you go up to a normal person at a cocktail party and ask them, what's your speaking style? They probably don't have an answer. That's just not something that you normally have to think about in your day-to-day life. So with her, it was very much about developing that style, figuring out what was comfortable for her, the sorts of phrases she liked to like, the length, the font size on the page, all the little things, figuring that out with her, which was an interesting process. But on the other hand, I currently work at Gates Ventures, which is the private office of Bill Gates, as a writer for Bill.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, you might have heard of him.
I think he's got high potential.
Yeah, I think he's going places.
I think if
he's
he
a
sticks
young
with it,
up-and-comer.
he could be something, yeah.
Right. But because Bill has been public for 40 years at this point, I could spend all day for a year reading interviews and transcripts and watching videos of him, and I'd still have more to watch just because he's been doing media in the public eye for decades. So for someone like that, that's gold for a speechwriter, because you can just go back and read his words and just figure out, he's fully formed and out in the world as a speaker, so you can go and kind of figure out his style and then transform, and that's out there and those resources are there. And then sometimes with a speechwriter, you have a situation like the one I had at the Democratic Convention where we had 240 speeches to write for the speakers of the convention, and there were 15-ish of us writing them. And most of these speakers I was never going to meet until basically 10 minutes before they went on stage, and I sat with them backstage and did a little speech prep with them. And this is senators and mayors and heads of organizations, CEOs, all of the speakers at the Democratic National Convention. And with them, you have no time with them to figure out, oh, okay, this person likes to use this word, or this is the way they like to talk about it. So YouTube is your best friend in that scenario of just I spent 10 minutes per speaker watching clips of them. And it's not ideal. That's not going to give you enough to really capture someone's voice, but you can get some hints in 10 minutes of, oh, they like to make jokes, they don't like to make jokes, they really like applause lines, they like to get off the stage quickly. You can pick up on that pretty quickly.
And so when you're working with a principal, walk us through your writing process from the first time that you get the engagement, say Secretary Pritzker is going to be speaking to Y audience on X date. Take us from there through the moment where she gets on the stage to deliver it. Like, what's that process?
Sure. So again, different for every speech, but in general, for Penny, what it would happen, whether it was 5 days before a speech was given or 5 months before, usually there's a stakeholder for a speech. It's someone internally in the organization that's pushing, hey, Penny should go speak at this event. I want her to do it because of this. And they have to make the case to the scheduling office as to why this is a worthwhile use of her time. So my first step is always talking to that person and understanding, okay, why was this important to you? What do you hope to achieve here? what's your goal? And then sometimes that person is also the substantive expert who can give me sort of the meat of the speech, because as a speechwriter, I'm a mile wide and an inch deep. I have no expertise in anything except for writing speeches, but in terms of the substance of something, I'm not a policy person, so I rely on that. And sometimes the stakeholder of the speech is the person who can provide that substance. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're just someone who's in a political function and they're just sort of pushing for it for political reasons, but they can direct me to the person who's the expert, and I'll sit down with them and get as much information as I can need. I want all of the numbers, all of the facts. I want to know every Wikipedia entry that I could possibly read to get me up to date on this. I want all of the information, and once I've gathered all of that, and it's usually enough information for 10 speeches on the topic, but usually once you have that, I'll sit down, and I like to just crank out a speech really quickly. So
you're the kind of writer that you just do, like, just write everything and then you'll do corrections later, but you just want to get everything on page?
Right, I don't edit as I go. I just spew it all out, usually in a couple hours, depending on how long the speech is, just because at that point I've spent so many hours doing research, and I've already got a good idea in my head of how I want to structure it and how I want to tie everything together, that I'll do it really quickly, and then I'll go back and edit it, tighten it up, send it around to the sort of policy, internal folks who are not the principal, but you got some speeches from time to time, all of the relevant stakeholders, and usually they come back with lots of corrections of, you got this wrong, or...
Mostly it's, you didn't talk enough about the particular thing I'm working on.
Right, that was a common one. There was a lot of like, but why didn't you mention my pet project?
Yeah.
And usually there was a very good reason we didn't, which is that speeches are by nature a very topical medium. They're not for going in depth. Unless you're listening to like one of the great orators of our time, like an Obama or a Bill Clinton, the human ear is not capable of listening to a speech for more than 15 minutes. Like someone's at a podium talking at you, you can't follow it for longer than that, unless it's someone who's really exceptionally talented, and that's like the equivalent of like a LeBron James in basketball. Like, you can count those people on one hand. So it's all about keeping it short, and being short means things have to be left out, which was always, I spent a lot of my time telling you and others, like, I understand your program is super important, however, there's these other top-line messages that are really important to get out there. Mm-hmm. And then once we get that feedback, we get everyone in an agreement on a draft, and then you would take it to the principal. And Penny was a very hands-on principal. That's pretty common. If someone, when you're saying the words out of your mouth, you want every single one to be what you want, because it's, at the end of the day, it's her name on it. She's the one saying it. If she gets something wrong or something misrepresents her beliefs, that's on her. I mean, I might get in a little trouble behind the scenes, but like, it's not my name on it at the end of the day. She's the one who's gonna, be owning the thing. So she was very hands-on. We would sit down with her in speech prep, usually for about 45 minutes to an hour per speech for like a 20-minute long 20-minute long keynote speech, and she would go through line by line and say, sometimes it was big picture stuff of, I think this argument's not sharp enough, I think this isn't quite how I think about this issue. Sometimes it's these little things of, you use the word could here and I would use the word would. Like little, and that's pretty normal for a speaker to want to go to that level of granularity. Then I go back, make the edits, send it back to her. If she's happy with it, great. It's locked, we get it all printed out and she's ready to go and deliver it. If not, sometimes it's like a negotiation going back and forth on, okay, you wanted this fix, here's how I fixed it, are you okay with that? No, and we just go back and forth until everyone's happy with it. But the ultimate goal is that your speaker at the end of the day is happy and feels comfortable with what they're saying, because again, they're the ones saying it. They're the face that's owning it.
Was Secretary Pritzker somebody who wanted to do a lot of dry runs of actually her delivering the speech? Or once she had the text, was she pretty comfortable with that? Or did you actually do run-throughs with her where she would actually deliver the speech?
Almost never. I would say it's probably fewer than a dozen times that we ever went through. Those were only for really, really big, high-stakes speeches. But for the most part, I mean, when you're giving a speech, when you're a cabinet secretary, you are giving, in a given week, 10 to 15 speeches. So like at that point, you've got it down. You're a pro. She occasionally she would want to do a little work on it, but for the most part, she was a pro. It was, she, as soon as she got a speech and she was okay with what it said, she knew how to knock it out of the park. So we didn't need to do a lot of practice. But there are some speakers do like to do that. It's just personal taste.
And is it something the more you write for one particular person, the more you get comfortable with them and their style and their rhythm and?
Right, and it's a two-way street too. Of once, the more time you spend with someone, there's no point when you max out on how you understand the person you're writing for. You can always understand them a little bit better. You can always more accurately capture what's going on in their head. So from my perspective, it just takes time to build that relationship. But then from the principal's perspective, it's also all about trust. There's nothing more intimate than putting words in someone else's mouth. And so for her, or for any principal, it's about developing that trust back in a speechwriter of knowing, okay, what they give me is not going to make me sound like a fool. It's not going to make me look silly. It's going to make me look serious and professional, which she is. And so it's about developing that two-way trust. So it's a very interesting and intimate relationship between a speechwriter and a principal, which is part of the reason I really enjoy it as a profession, but it's definitely unique in the realm of politics.
And so to tie that work into the topic of our discussion group, we're obviously really focused here on the topic of trade, and you were a speechwriter during a particularly interesting time. So as we've talked about at some of our other discussion groups, this is time when the Department of Commerce generally and Secretary Pritzker specifically was at the forefront of what the Obama administration was doing in 2015, 2016 in trying to talk to the American people about the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the hope that we would be able to get this agreement ratified by the US Congress. And so talk to us about your experience helping Secretary Pritzker articulate a message in support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
It was I mean, this is just as well as I do. It was a fascinating time to work in trade. And even though the Commerce Secretary has a particularly wide spread of responsibilities, even compared to other members of the cabinet, because commerce, yes, it's trade, but it's also patents and weather and satellites and Census Bureau, so many things. But even with that widespread, I would say at least half of our speeches were trade, and it probably more than that. If they weren't outright, the goal of the speech was to promote TPP, they always mentioned TPP. Mm-hmm. It was, I was like dreaming about TPP because we would write about it so much. And it was an interesting time because on the one hand, we were talking about it constantly, and you have to remember the constituency for the Secretary of Commerce is the American business community. So even as this sort of tempest was raging in politics as a whole around TPP and a lot of the controversy and it taking its prominence in the 2016 election, in the American business community, they overwhelmingly supported it. That's an overwhelmingly pro-free trade community. So it was this sort of weird dichotomy of like you were very aware in the background that TPP was suddenly become this buzzword, and it was, people were having protests about it and candidates were stumping about it. But then in sort of in our world, and especially who we were speaking to, they loved it, they wanted it. So it was a weird time to be working on something like that, where it's like you're sort of insulated, but also in the thick of it at the same time.
Was that a bit of a challenge, and do you feel like, with the advantage of hindsight, that we, the Department of Commerce, the administration, because of who we were talking to, or because of who the secretary was talking to, we were in a little bit of a bubble and maybe didn't fully understand how much opposition to TPP there was because we were getting mostly positive feedback from audiences? Do you think there was a little bit of that?
Absolutely. It's funny, I haven't worked on trade in a while, so I was refreshing myself with some news clips over the last couple days, and just looking at the news from 2016, when we were talking about trade and TPP, every single day, and I mean, we would get news clips. It's not like we weren't paying attention to the news, but like rereading those articles from 2016 that are just reporting on what Bernie was saying on the trail and Trump and eventually Hillary, it's just I kind of forgot how heated it was, and it was such a big issue for all three of those campaigns in terms of like, it was just such like a hot topic issue, which is very unusual for an election cycle. Like trade is usually not a thing that's at the top of mind for voters. So it's, that was sort of a weird thing. And I don't think at the time we fully appreciated how prominent it was, because it hadn't been basically in any election since 1992 when Perot ran anti-NAFTA. But other than that, trade had not been a thing in an election. I think we were a little naive to the sense of like, oh, it's just a passing thing. Like TPP will still happen. And I remember feeling very confident about TPP in the summer of 2016, but then I read the news clips from the same era now, and I'm like, oh, that was little bit of misplaced confidence.
What's that like to be? I mean, we were out there and as you say, writing these speeches, giving these speeches, and putting us back in that time. What was it like to be out there doing that when Bernie is out there railing against TPP, Donald Trump is talking about this be the worst trade deal ever. Finally, Secretary Clinton, who was a member of the president's cabinet, comes out against TPP. What was that dynamic like when you have that administration, but this noise from the presidential campaign trail is so strong?
Right. I mean, in terms, again, because we were talking to the business community, a lot of the text of the actual speeches and the audiences we were speaking to didn't really change because everyone loved TPP. There was never a speech where the secretary would go and speak and someone would stand up in the back and chant like an anti-TPP chant, like you would see at political rallies. So that we never were faced with that. But the messaging did have to shift a little. There was definitely much more of a focus in those last 6 months before the election of, hey, business leaders, we need you to go back to your communities and explain to your workers, to your neighbors, to your friends, to your family, please tell them why TPP is important because people don't get it. So that was not something that the first couple years I was there, we weren't really doing that. You would occasionally ask business leaders to go out and advocate for it, but it was very rare. And by the end, it was every single speech. It almost didn't matter who we were talking to. I think we might have slipped the ask into a speech of meteorologists at one point, of like, hey, you guys are weather people, but also TPP is great, and please tell your friends. Like that's the point that we were at by the end, which was pretty bizarre in retrospect.
Yeah, and so you'll remember this story. So Arun Venkataraman was one of our guests earlier, and he told the story, and I think the company was Caterpillar was the company, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was Caterpillar, where they started putting into their employees' paychecks a part of how much of their salary was derived from exports. Because we kept making this argument that jobs, working for companies that export pay better than working for companies that don't export, that there's these net economic benefits. It benefited workers, it benefited companies. And so Caterpillar eventually put into your pay stub, you could see X part of your salary was related to exports to try to hammer home and convince people that it actually was affecting people in their pocketbook, the ability to have access to markets and reach the consumers, the 95% of whom are outside of the US. And so this gets me to something that I think is just a political messaging kind of question. And it seems to me, and let me know what you think, is there an inherent advantage to just being against something, right?
Absolutely.
Because no policy is perfect, right? So as soon as you come out there with any specific policy, you're immediately having opponents who are going to talk about all the downsides to it, all the things that aren't perfect about it, all the compromises that you've had to make to get to that point. But when you're against something, you can just say, I'm against this, period. You don't have to offer an alternative. You don't have to develop your own proposal. So there's this beautiful simplicity to just saying no. So talk to us about that.
Right. I mean, it's, there's the old saying of it's easier to tear down a house than it is to build one. And I don't think it's necessarily a criticism at all of the people who say no, because it's an important tool and there's a lot of value in saying no that you can take advantage of. But it's so much easier to not have to just say that's bad than it is to explain why something's good. Like if you look at the statements that Bernie made in 2016 about TPP, he used the phrase anti-worker trade agreement, which for us at Commerce was like, a shot through the heart, but it's brilliant messaging because you hear the phrase anti-worker, it's 10 letters, it is doing so much work for you because it doesn't matter to you how it's anti-worker or why. It's bad if it's anti-worker. That's not good. You don't like that. But then you look at the phrase pro-worker. Okay, pro-worker in what way? Is it because there's robust labor protections? Is it because it's creating jobs? Is it because it's increasing wages? That's not an insurmountable messaging challenge, but it's harder because you have to justify it a little bit more than you do with no. It's anti-worker. Okay, that's bad. I get it. That speaks to me as a person. I don't like that. Mm-hmm. And just having to make the case on the other side, you're already, for one thing, you're starting knockback on your heels. You're just automatically defensive of you're rebutting people's criticisms. Just puts you in a position the same way it would not in politics at all. If you're at your dinner table and you're arguing with your brother. And and you get defensive, you look you're weaker already from that position. So it's not a great place to start. But it's also part of the name of the game in politics of someone's always going to be pro and someone's always going to be anti. And sometimes no could be on either side of that. But just being able to say, the simplicity of it's anti-worker, it just makes it so much easier. And I disagreed with a lot of Bernie's assessment of TPP in the election, but you cannot deny that the way he messaged it and the way he was able to harness that to whip up voters was brilliant. I think he totally defeated us on that front.
So I still remember a lot of our messaging. 95% of consumers live outside the US, and our companies need to have access to these markets, set the rules of the road in one of the fastest growing parts of the world. We continually called TPP a high standard agreement when it came to labor and environment. Looking back, though, do you think there's anything the Obama administration could have done differently in terms of messaging to the American people about trade generally, TPP specifically, that could have made the people and then in turn the Congress more supportive of TPP?
Absolutely. I look back at some of the ways we being the Obama administration collectively, talked about TPP, and it's like, what were we doing? It was so, even those talking points, which you just repeated, which I've written verbatim hundreds of times, they're so clinical. They mean nothing to the average person. And I think that was our big mistake, was we didn't get personal, whereas the other side, whether it's Trump or Bernie or even Hillary when she came around later, was all about people. It was about you are going to lose your job, you are going to make less money, and people get that. I think we were so clinical and focused on the business case. The fact that we use the word customer so many times, the average person doesn't care about the customer of Caterpillar or a big company. They care about the consumer and who they are and whether they have a job. And I think we made a big mistake by not making it personal and talking about, we always use the 95% of the world's customers are outside the US borders. That was our lead-off line. And that just doesn't, if you're talking to business community, absolutely, hyper relevant, great talking point. If you're talking to voters and the average constituent, it just doesn't matter. But then you look at what the other side is saying, and it's all about your job, your money, your family. And I think in the United States, for better or for worse, our identities are so closely tied up with our employment. I mean, you look at, you see a 5-year-old and you ask them what they want to be when they grow up. And yes, they might give a kind of fun answer if I want to be an astronaut or a rock star, but you're still asking them. You don't ask them, who do you want to be when you grow up? You ask them what they want to be when they grow up. And having a job in this country is so personal and tied to our identity in a way that it's not in a lot of other countries. And so the notion of that job and that identity going away because of a trade agreement is just, it's intense and it's intimate and it's personal. I don't think we did a great job of acknowledging that and calibrating our messaging to take care of that anxiety, the very real anxiety that exists around, I'm going to lose my job, and ergo, I'm going to lose who I am as a person.
So I want to dive into that a little bit deeper. I mean, what would that have looked like? Let's workshop that a little bit. What would that have looked like to try to create that message? What would that message look like if we were going to try to talk to people on a more personal level about trade and TPP?
I think for one thing, unless you're talking to the business community, banish the word customer from the vocabulary, because it just instantly tells you that's the CEO, that's not the worker. So that tells you what level playing field you're going on. I would make it now. I think it depends if is this a campaign message or just a general?
This would be if we could go back and had the advantage of trying to again message to the American people in 2015, 2016 about the benefits of TPP. How should we have talked to them in a better, more compelling way?
I think we should have made it about the 21st century economy instead of trade. I think trade, for the most part, has become a dirty word, and I don't know that any amount of messaging is going to fix that. So I think find a way to talk about trade without using the words trade and trade agreement. I think you leading off with doing business with the rest of the world creates jobs here at home, raises wages, make it about the person, make it about doing business. It's a little sleight of hand because yes, we're absolutely still talking about globalization and trade agreements and opening up liberalization of markets, but it's using language that people relate to and that resonates with them on a personal level, and also doesn't sound like you're talking about the benefit of the CEO and the executives only, which I think it's a little disingenuous to say now that we know that so much of the language focus has gone on billionaires and CEOs versus workers. We couldn't have known that in 2016, but I think taking what we know now and looking back at that, taking advantage of the notion of focusing on the worker, and this will create jobs for you, not for some ambivalent, employee of a company somewhere else. This will create jobs for you. It will improve your wages. It will make your community stronger. And leaning in on that and the personal side, which sounds so obvious now in retrospect, but we didn't really do it for the most part.
So how do you think about, and I'm thinking this in terms of trade, but also feel free to answer this just more generally. Because obviously when you're selling something, obviously you want to emphasize the good parts about what you're selling, but did we a little bit whistle past the graveyard and just not have an honest enough conversation with people about trade is a net benefit for all of these reasons, but it's not a benefit to every single person. And did we sort of fail to acknowledge that there are downsides? Trade creates challenges for certain communities, for certain segments of the workforce. And did it almost feel like we were trying to only talk about the good things and not acknowledging the bad things? And how do you balance that when you're trying to message, right? Nobody wants to say, well, let me first start talking to you about the 3 things that are really bad about this policy that I'm for. But I felt like there was a disconnect of whistling past the graveyard and not talking about things that there were communities where people had seen what had happened because of trade, and they knew that it wasn't always a net positive for every single person. How do you acknowledge those things?
I think the prime currency in all of political messaging is honesty. And which is not to suggest at all that we were dishonest or disingenuous in any way, but I think people appreciate when you level with them. I think that's why Donald Trump has really resonated with so many people, because for better or worse, he levels with people. I mean, you can argue about whether what he's saying is sincere, but he's being honest with people about how they feel and acknowledging their anxieties. And I think we didn't do enough of that, but also part of the reason I think we didn't do enough of that is it's really hard to do that and also defend your position. And I wish I could say there's a magic phrase we could use or something to help us balance the two, but I do think that there's a lot of value in going to people and say, look, I get it. There's a lot of communities in this country that have been decimated by trade. And there's a lot of people, even if the argument of NAFTA was a net good, or at least that NAFTA gained as many jobs as it lost, that doesn't matter if it's your job that was lost. And I think acknowledging that, and especially going into those communities and just listening to people and hearing what they have to say and saying, look, I hear you. I understand this has been a really difficult thing for you. I understand that you don't trust free trade agreements. You're absolutely right to. That's a valid thing for you to think. Here's why this one is different, or here's why this is still a net good for you. You're still going to have a lot of people saying, that doesn't matter, I lost my job. And that's fine, and I don't know, honestly, that we're ever going to convince those people, because maybe we shouldn't. The trade will leave some people behind. That's the unfortunate thing about it. But you can't pretend that those people don't exist.
Right.
And you can't not acknowledge that. But also, it's almost condescending in a way to go to them and say, look, I understand this created this terrible hardship in your life, but it's still great. I don't want to use the phrase write people off, but let those people have their opinions and understand that that's a thing that they're going to have. And there's a lot of people in the country who are not directly impacted by trade and who benefit from it, and find a way to acknowledge the people that were hurt, but also communicate to the people who benefit from it, a net benefit, because we all benefit from it in some ways, but on the whole, if you've lost your job, it doesn't matter that your air conditioner was $200 cheaper than it was 10 years ago.
Right. And you had this interesting experience, and Meghan won't say this, so I want to say it. So Meghan was, because of her excellent work that she did at the Department of Commerce, and because she was recognized as such a tremendously talented speechwriter, was asked to take a brief leave from the Department of Commerce and to write speeches for the 2016 Democratic National Convention. And some of that speech writing put you on the opposite side of the TPP arguments that we were making at the Department of Commerce. So talk to us about what that process was, what that experience was like, and your experience with that.
I mean, I still remember when you have you come into a convention with a party platform, and the Democratic Party platform was not totally anti-TPP at that point because Obama was still the head of the party, and that was obviously a huge thing for him. But like, we're going in knowing that the messaging for the convention is the party platform, and the party platform is kind of iffy at best on TPP to acknowledge the progressive flank's concerns about it. So, I go in knowing like, okay, oh boy, this is going to be a different adjustment of like how, the usual gung-ho message we have. But then, I sat down and I got my list of speakers of who I was writing for, and because of what I did at Commerce, I was given all of the econ speeches, which included a fair amount of trade ones, and all of there was not a single pro-TPP speech at the convention, which was the smart move politically. But there was not, I sat down, I look at my list, and like a lot of these are senators and members of Congress that like we have written speeches and to go into their districts and try to convince their constituents to disagree with them on. So I was like, oh boy, this is gonna be a ride. And I still remember one of the most bizarre moments of the convention. I was writing for a senator that I won't name who was very vocally anti-TPP. And his speech was supposed to be like a trade speech. And it was supposed to be sort of like shoring up Clinton's credentials of being anti-TPP. And I remember, I sat down with him right before he went on, and he really wanted to like add an applause line attacking TPP. And I'm like sitting on the couch with him, like carefully helping him craft this like TPP's terrible and it's gonna ruin everything. And it was like bullying my child. Like on the outside, I'm like helping him and coming up with it, but like inside, I was dying.
Yeah.
And then, I go back 5 days later to my normal job, and it's all back to TPP's great, and I love it. But that hurt me a little. But it was also so much easier to write that attack line than it was to write any of our TPP, pro-TPP stuff, for the same reason of no's just easier. It's easier to come up with something that'll get people applauding if it's taking something down than building something up.
So, piggybacking on that, so if a 2020 candidate came to you and said, hey, Meghan, I want to come out with a position on trade that is broadly supportive of trade, but I want to acknowledge, and I want to have a real conversation with the American people about the pluses and minuses of trade, and I want to do it in the context of a 21st century global economy, and I need you to help me with that message. How would you think about that? How would you approach that?
It's in an alternate universe of 2020, that's not the scenario we're in. It might be different, but in this 2020, regardless of whether it was one of the Democratic primary candidates or potential Republican challenger for Trump, I'd say go all anti-Trump. Make it entirely about him. Make it about him killing the auto industry, putting farmers out of work, making it so everything you buy is more expensive. Make it about that. Make it about him, which in some ways will make it a lot easier, I think, for free traders this go around, because Trump is he claims to be a free trader, but he's clearly not based on what he's done. And I think his record is very easy to attack. And it's easy to attack in a way that you don't have to know anything about trade to get it, because you can just say, Trump's gonna make it so when you go to the store this weekend to buy a birthday gift from your grandma, it's more expensive. Like, you say that, people get it, they're upset. So I think that puts us in a stronger position as pro-free trade people, and just because you don't have to define it, you can stay away from the dirty word of trade. Of like, you don't have to, we've kind of moved beyond the ground of is TPP going to hurt workers, because there's not even a TPP that we're fighting for at this point. It's Trump going and doing bilateral agreements and just slapping tariffs on everyone, which, using the word tariffs, I think in messaging isn't great because it's very technical, and I don't think people necessarily, even if you know what a tariff is, it's just sort of wonky. It doesn't resonate with people. But just the idea of Trump's creating a trade war, Trump's driving up prices. Look at all these auto plants that are closing. Look at these farmers who had to get a $12 billion bailout. Like, people get that, and it's a good position, I think, to be in as a free trader in 2020.
So, but when you look into your crystal ball, do you think there's a chance that we'll see that kind of messaging from a major 2020 candidate from either party? Do that kind of message, or do you think it'll be largely just stick to what feels safe, and that's anti-trade?
Right. I think we will. I think it will, and I think that message is interesting because it works equally for the Bernie Sanders wing of the party as it does for Biden. That has nothing to do with whether you think we need new multilateral trade agreements. Like, those statements apply for all sectors of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see it, but I don't think we'll see it labeled as trade. Like, I don't think there will come a point, even when we move into the general, where you'll be able to go to a candidate's website and click on the issues page, and it'll say healthcare, national security, trade. I don't think there will not be a trade subhead. It will be attacking Trump on the economy, and it'll be just part of the general economic message. But I would be surprised if the word trade comes up, unless it's in the context of like the bad trade he's doing. But I think it'll just be wrapped into the he's hurting the economy, he's setting us back, we need to reverse course before it's too late messaging. Which I don't think as a pro-tree trade person is necessarily a bad thing at this point. Like reversing his policy, what he's done with tariffs would be a net win if you're a free trader. So I don't think that's necessarily like reason to be bummed out if you're a free trade person. But I don't think you're going to see someone coming out saying like we need a new TPP. People just don't campaign on that.
Right.
Even looking back, the only time trade agreements have ever been an election issue, it's anti. There's no one's ever like campaigning on it because it's just not something you can campaign on based on the way that they're negotiated. Like it's just not something that you could. It's not a good stump speech message.
Right. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. What questions do folks have for Meghan? Let's wait till the microphone gets to you. Got Alex here.
You talked about your role as a speech writer, but how does that relate to being a speech coach?
So they are technically different things, but they overlap a lot. So there are people who are just speech writers, and there are people who are full-time speech coaches. Like at the convention, for example, every single speaker, except for like the Michelle Obamas, like true primetime people, even if they're like senators who give speeches all the time, were required to do coaching. And that was with someone who that's their only job, and we went into a room with it was set up like the real thing, and they had the teleprompter and the thing, and they delivered the speech, and there's like a professional speech coach going through it, and that's their entire job. But it is a job of a speechwriter to make recommendations on delivery. When I'm writing a speech, I hear it in my head. I hear my boss's voice in my head all the time, which is there's a lot to unpack behind that. But when you're writing it, you hear it a certain way. You're imagining, okay, this person will say this, and they'll pause, and there will be applause, or they'll emphasize this word. Like there's some sentences in the English language that can be read multiple ways depending on where you put the emphasis. So it's my job as a speechwriter to instruct someone of like, okay, put the emphasis on this word, maybe let a little room to breathe after this because people might applaud, or maybe they won't. There's like a magic length of time that you can wait where it doesn't seem weird and like you're waiting for applause. There's some coaching like that, but if you're really going out to do like a speech tour or like a national convention where you're in prime time in front of millions of people, then you bring in the real pros, because my expertise is limited more to the specific words of a speech as opposed to like, I can help you become the world's greatest speaker off the cuff.
But so my follow-up question is having worked with a couple different principals, how much, what is you think the room for growth that people have of is being a really great speaker, an Obama, a Clinton? I mean, I'm thinking of some sort of kind of great orators, Ted Kennedy in his prime. How much of that is just intuitive, and you either have that or you don't, or how much if that can be coached, right?
I think it's a lot like basketball, where this is going to sound like I'm degrading normal NBA players, like they're not exceptional athletes, but like an average point guard is like, yes, he's very, very good, but like through a ton of hard work and coaching, you could maybe become a point guard in a college team. Let's say like a Division I college team. You can't just become LeBron James. There's no amount of there's no amount of coaching that's going to turn me into LeBron James. So I think with those truly exceptional orators, like the ones you just named, it's just a gift. Like especially Obama's kind of the easiest to see, because you look at Obama's White House Correspondents' Dinner speeches, which are comedy, which like the difference between a good comedian and just someone who happens to be kind of funny to their friends is like a comedian knows how to read the room and wait for beats in a way that like, yeah, you can pick up on it by watching people, but like you look at like a good comedian and it's just, they just got it, There's like a sense of, okay, I should wait this long, I can react this way, I should alter to take advantage of this mood switch, and Obama's got it. You watch those White House Correspondents' Dinner speeches, he's got the instincts of a professional comedian, which is wild because that's way too many things for him to be good at. But someone like that, that's innate. You can there's little tricks you can teach people about, waiting for applause lines. Applause lines are really hard to deliver. Like if you've ever given a toast at a wedding, just like delivering it so you're not stomping on the applause and you're not, it's a very difficult thing to do. There's a certain amount of coaching you can do and like helping people feel more comfortable with that. But in terms of like blowing the roof off a place, it's a lot of that's just natural talent.
Right.
And good speech writing, but mostly natural talent.
And hiring people like Meghan. I think was there a question in here?
Hey, Megan, what would you say the biggest difference is between having to write for a person, having to write like a speech or do communications work for a person, as opposed to having to write and do communications work on some kind of like concept like trade or TPP? Right. What do you think the challenges are associated with each of those, and how do you get over those challenges?
On the one hand, if you were just writing, sort of like a position paper that's not necessarily attached to a certain person's name or is just sort of a general defense of something, you are free to make whatever arguments you want to make. You can make, sometimes there are things that I'm like, if I were making this argument, this is what I would say. The person I'm writing for would never in a million years say that, even though I think it's a good argument and a compelling thing. So if you're writing, just sort of a general thing or in your own voice, you can put in what you think is the best argument and all the pieces of it. Whereas when you're writing for someone, you really do, you can't put words in their mouth that they wouldn't say on their own. I always like to say that speech writing is the art of making people sound 25% better than they would if they just went up there. Because if you're an elected official, you're probably a pretty smart, well-informed person to begin with, and my goal is to make you just a little bit better. I see some skepticism.
Some skepticism in the audience.
Generally speaking. But part of the drawback of that is you have to say the things that they would say. There's been times that I have written beautiful, quotable applause lines that I'm so proud of. I'm like, oh my God, this is great. This could be in a book of quotes someday. And it's not what they would say. And it has to go. It doesn't matter that I think it's beautiful and moving and lovely and the best work I've ever done. If it's not what the person would say, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. That just goes back in my private bitter archive.
So I'm a person who has been convinced by the mathematical proofs or the history that free trade is good. But you had mentioned that trade now is a dirty word. Mm-hmm. How could you convince someone otherwise in a way which is intuitive, that doesn't rely on showing them an equation or drawing up, a textbook?
I am always a big fan of the hypothetical, like especially if it's the kind of scenario of like, you're home for Thanksgiving and your uncle's trying to fight with you about trade and you're trying to whatever. Talk about the hypothetical of, the example I always love to use with trade is air conditioners, which is, okay, do you have an air conditioner in your home? Probably. Only 1 out of every 10 homes doesn't. So you likely have an air conditioner in your home. That's probably a good thing for you. It gets pretty hot in the summer. It's nice. You get to sleep. If you're older, it's critical to your health. The reason you are able to afford an air conditioner is largely because of free trade. And I think using examples like that and helping people understand, especially the consumer piece of it, I think that's another thing that in the Obama administration we could have emphasized more of like, if you start talking to people about how much prices will increase if you get rid of trade agreements, they become pro-free trade in a hurry. Because all of a sudden the things that you're spending money on get way more expensive. And I think pointing to that, especially when you're dealing with like, that's a little hard to do in a speech because it just seems kind of odd to like shout at a room about air conditioners. But like if you're one-on-one with someone and you're just trying to convince a friend or someone else, I think going to those examples, especially in the consumer level, if they're not in a field that will directly benefit from trade, then it's pretty easy to say like, oh, you work in a high-tech field, exports are great for you because of this, this, and this. But if you're just talking to a normal person, I think the consumer argument of like, do you like being able to have things that are affordable? That's free trade. That's a helpful argument, I think.
I was living and working on K Street in Washington, D.C. until October of 2016. And for the audience, TPP was really personal. They would shut down the streets of Washington, D.C. with protests. They had cool dragons, but talk a little bit about speakers who freelance. I was a speechwriter as well, and you'll be listening to your words, and then all of a sudden, it's like your pen goes off the page because they've wandered off, and they may not be familiar. That I don't think the current occupant of the White House uses a teleprompter much, but
right.
Talk a little bit about the freelancing.
So freelancing of speechwriting is a very interesting field because the people who have dedicated speechwriters are largely people who understand the value of them. Whereas if you're a president or a senator or a cabinet member, or even most CEOs have them now, you understand the value of a speechwriter because you're giving speeches all of the time. And so you like, and you don't have time to write them yourself, so you're glad to have this person who does it for you. A lot of people who hire freelancers, it's because they're giving, they might give a speech once every couple months, or it's just not something they do regularly, and there's a little bit of a hurdle of having to explain of like, this is why it's better for me to help you to do this than for you to do it yourself.
I mean when the speaker freelances.
Oh, when the speaker freelances. Oh my gosh.
That, I'm sorry.
Oh, so sometimes it's not bad. My boss right now almost never reads what's off the page, and it's fine, because he's not crazy, and so like usually, and he's a very smart person, so usually when Bill is speaking, he isn't reading the words on the page, he's never reading them verbatim, and he's really only using them as like sort of a, it's there if he chokes up, but which he almost never does. And so on that point, it's fine. There's a lot of people who can, you can kind of give them some ideas and they can just go. On the other hand, Trump is the single greatest argument for why speechwriters should exist. And like on a selfish level, I'm like, thank you for showing people what happens when you don't have a professional helping craft your stuff. Because you look at his speeches and they're 90 minutes long, often 2 hours, and they're so hard to follow. Like, taking aside his politics, even if you agree with him, they're so hard to follow. But I mean, he does have he's a really good talent of like pulling out like quotes that you can pull on the nightly news. So like that part he does very well. But like they're really hard to follow. If you ask someone walking out of one of his speeches, what was Trump's speech about tonight? They usually can't, you should be able to say, oh, well, this was a speech in support of TPP. Oh, this is about healthcare. You usually can't say that about Trump's speeches. So, but then he also gets a lot of news coverage and his message is resonating. So I guess, I mean, you can't criticize it too hard because it seems to be working with some people, but I personally think it's an argument for why having someone help you structure a speech and stick to the prompter and like understand your message and like go in with a focus, he's a pretty good case for why that's a valuable tool.
And I don't know the answer to this. Had Secretary Pritzker ever worked with a speechwriter before she was at Commerce? Do you know?
She had, yeah. I mean, she was in business for a long time, so she had most high-level business people will give speeches at some point, and most of them will hire speechwriters. So she had worked with one off and on, but it's really hard. Even if you give, let's say, one speech a month, every month for 5 years, it's very different than giving speeches regularly, just in terms of developing your voice and tone and figuring out how you like to do it. Because it's just like anything else. The more you do it, the more you understand. It's like working out. Like the more you work out, the more you know, okay, I like doing this and I don't like doing this exercise and I feel really comfortable doing this. And it's a very similar thing, which she had used some before.
You mentioned that it was kind of a winding road to get into the position that you're in now, but what would you say for someone who might be interested to be a speechwriter one day, what would you say was probably the most valuable part of like your education or career experience that really got you to where you are?
So I'd say, just in terms of preparing me to be a speechwriter, I actually studied poetry in college, which if you had told me poetry would lead to a very happy and fulfilling career, I would have thought you were insane, even at the time. But I'm
sure your parents felt the same way.
My parents definitely agreed. But I took a lot of poetry workshops in college, which at the time was just about getting my feelings out to, whatever, normal 18-year-old stuff. But at the time, but when I look at it now, poetry is all about economy of word. It's all about editing yourself down. It's about communicating emotions and feelings with as few words as possible. I think that really set me up. And the other thing that was big, just in general about a workshop class in particular, workshop classes are structured where you come in with your work every week, everyone else reads it and critiques it, which sucks. Honestly, it's really, really rough, especially when you first start doing it because you're coming in and you think you've done this great thing and then everyone's like, I don't get it, or this line's terrible, or whatever. But that experience is probably the single most helpful thing, because being a speechwriter is having everyone tell you your work sucks all the time. And that's how it gets better, it's part of the job. It's not a bad thing. But that experience taught me how to take criticism and also how to give criticism back, because I was doing it to other folks. So if I'm if I'm sitting down with a principal and they say, oh, I want to change this line to this, I can both take that criticism without feeling like I want to crawl in a hole and die because they've criticized my beautiful work. But I can also give it back and say, okay, you want to fix it to this. This is why this isn't great. How about we find a compromise? And that skill set was really important for being able to do the job.
Any other questions?
You kind of alluded to this when answering an earlier question, but it seems to me that although President Trump is a highly unorthodox speaker, he's also been a very successful, persuasive speaker. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about the mechanics of maybe how that works, why he's been successful?
Yeah, I think Trump, for all of his faults, I think his greatest skill is he is very good at making complicated things simple. And you can argue about why he's good at that, and you could argue that that's because of his understanding of things. But I think in terms of his effectiveness, it's a huge tool of he is able to talk about these incredibly complicated things, and he turns it into these one-line zingers that are super emotional, that get right to the heart of what people are anxious about, and that resonates. And he's so good at that. He also just really gets the media, so he knows how to make things edgy enough that people will complain about them on Twitter, which ultimately ends up helping him because then his line gets disseminated 10 times fold than what it would be if he just said it in a room and no one listened. So I think he's just really good at boiling it down to these sort of talking points. And yeah, and I think when he kind of takes the idea of politics should be personal to the extreme of you can argue about whether there's substance behind it, but in terms of getting people to listen to you and to believe you, that's a great tool, being able to get people emotional and speaking to them on their language, using the language they use, just being super emotional and boiling it down. That's a huge part, I think, of why he won in 2016, because a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle were always, and anyone in political messaging, you're sort of trained of okay, you have to have your talking points, you have to have your 95% of the world's customers are outside the border, and your substance backing up, which is important. And in terms of actually getting legislation through and getting policies passed, you have to have that. But in terms of messaging, it's not great, just because people don't care. People care about, oh, I'm going to lose my job. Oh, China's coming up on me, and I'm scared of that. And when you play on people's fears like that, it just really, it's a good cheat code to get you right to people listening to you and believing you.
What's your favorite political speech? What's a speech that you think is just a beautiful political speech that we should all go home and watch on YouTube?
The RFK on the hood of the car speech after MLK was assassinated is my favorite speech. It's also a terrible speech to always list as my example because he gave it on the fly. It was not written. I don't think he even had notes before he did it. He just stood on the hood of a car and gave this beautiful speech. I think he was in Indiana.
He's in Indianapolis,
right?
yeah.
Right, and he's on the hood of a car, and it's just him speaking freely about MLK's assassination, and it's 5 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, might even be shorter. It's really short. It's remarkable. It will make you cry. It also is credited with single-handedly quashing riots after it happened because it was just such a it was the exact message of healing that you need to hear after something like that. That is, if you've never seen it or read it, it's on YouTube. Go watch it immediately. It's so good. It will cry. Have tissue. Bring tissues. But that is the perfect example of how a speech can move people. And you listen to that, and granted, it'd be pretty weird if you were talking about policy in that moment. But it's just all emotion. It's just all recognizing the way people are feeling and meeting them on that level. And the empathy in it is remarkable, and it's a fantastic speech.
That's a great choice. That's such an amazing speech. If you listen to the raw audio, you can hear before he starts speaking that he bends down and he's talking to an aide and he says, do these people know?
Right.
And he's asking, because this is obviously pre-Twitter, pre-internet, pre-everything, and so you can hear him asking an aide, do these people know that Martin Luther King has been shot and murdered? And you can hear the aide say no.
And he says it, he opens his speech by announcing it, and you can hear the crowd gasp.
Yeah. It's a really moving speech. So if you were like, if we were playing fantasy delivering of speeches, like what are the traits that you would look for that make somebody a great speaker? Is it vocabulary? Is it cadence? Is it delivery? Is it their voice? What do you think are like, if you were going to build the LeBron James of giving a great speech, like what are the key things that you would want to meld together?
I think the number one trait that enables everything else is just comfort. Being comfortable in front of a crowd, it's a really unnatural thing for us as humans. It's not something that we do a lot generally in our lives. And like being able to go in front of a crowd and be relaxed and chill and not be like overthinking every single word. Doesn't matter, anything else I'm gonna say doesn't matter if you don't feel comfortable at that. So that's like peak. You gotta feel comfortable and loose doing whatever you're doing. You have to be able to respond to the crowd. In a truly worst case scenario, this is more in political speeches than anything we ever did at Commerce, but like in a campaign speech, you have to be able to notice like, oh, this isn't resonating. Like people are not feeling what I'm saying right now, especially during a stump speech, and be able to pivot away from that and like being able to pick up on the mood of the crowd. And if they aren't feeling it, you need to be able to, maybe you skip some paragraphs, maybe you go completely off script, you do whatever. You have to be able to pick up on that because that's a big one, especially in political campaigning. Being able to deliver a joke, super hard. Even if you're like the funniest person in your friend group, really hard to deliver a joke in a speech format and have it sound natural and actually make people laugh and not in like a like dad joke kind of awkward way. So being able to, having someone who can be genuinely funny is a huge asset, and it's very hard to find. Yeah, I would say those are the big ones. Definitely the looseness, and also just someone who is really interested in the craft in general, and not in the craft of speech writing specifically, but like people who really like giving speeches are better at them because they want to be more thoughtful. They tend to put more time into them. They tend to put a lot of like their energy into making them good. And as an audience member, you can see that. Like the people you can think of in your mind that are the best speakers, they really like speaking. I can guarantee you that.
Any final audience questions?
As a follow-up to that, is that the way you were speaking about that made me kind of remember what can go wrong with what you just talked about, and the image in my head that came to mind was Jeb Bush's infamous "please clap." Right. Is that a good example of what you're talking about when somebody can't pivot away or doesn't quite get the room correctly?
Yes, that is a perfect example of that. Rule number one of giving a speech should be never tell your audience when to clap. They should just be able to figure out. And like, yes, it happens to even the best speakers. Even Obama has had it happen where you say an applause line, you wait for the applause, and it doesn't come. Just move on. Like, people will forget that there was that awkward pause as soon as you get to the next sentence. Like, yes, you will remember it at night when you're like lying in bed trying to go to sleep. But like no, the audience won't remember it unless you draw attention to it, and especially by saying, please clap. But then another infamous incident of someone misreading a room, although I guess it wasn't necessarily the room, misreading the general ethos was Howard Dean's "Yeah." Which, like, I guess if you watch the clips of it, he's kind of matching the energy of the room. But that's one of those things of like, you have to have a little bit of control to recognize like, okay, yeah, that crowd was really raucous. You watch that and it's like a concert crowd, which is odd in general for a rally like that. But like, they're really into it. And like, just because it matched in the room, you also have to remember you're on TV, if you are on TV, and just not get so swept up into it that you do a "yeah" and ruin your career, which seems so quaint. In retrospect, like that's a thing that we were worried about.
Some of the students may not even remember that moment. Do you want to back up and give a little bit of the backstory of the Howard Dean moment?
This is the 2004 primary season, and Howard Dean was the front runner at the time, or if not the front runner, pretty close to it. And people were loving him, and he was like, he had this whole folksy thing that people really dug. And he would like get very excited in speeches, which was great. It was a lot of his appeal. Like he just like seemed like he was really happy and ebullient and whatever. But he was like at a rally in Iowa, I believe, and he was like doing a sort of a cadence of like, and we're gonna create jobs, and we're gonna raise wages, and we're gonna fix healthcare, and like like a building a crowd thing, which is what you do in a speech. And like the crowd was really into it, like cheering, doing this, and like he was just riding the moment, and just went yeah, and like did this and like screeched, which the idea of like that being career ending today in 2019 is insane. But at the time, it was the news for a week plus, and like it ruined his campaign. And after that, his poll started to tank. People thought he was insane. It was like sort of I guess it's like one of the first memes, probably. It was, it was like it was pre-social media, so it wasn't a meme in like a normal sense, but like it was a meme. The idea of like, you could like go into a party and make a "yeah" joke and like people would get it.
Any final questions for Meghan before we wrap up?
Ending on Howard Dean is a pretty good,
Well,
pretty good end.
I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you so much. Reminder that we've got our final session coming up next week. We're going to talk about trade enforcement with John McInerney, who was one of the experts in the country in trade enforcement and compliance. He was the chief counsel for trade enforcement and compliance at the Department of Commerce. And if you think about it, it's an incredibly relevant topic. We've talked about a lot of the substance of these trade agreements that we're negotiating. But one of the big holdups, especially with the agreement that we're talking about now with China, is making sure that we're going to be able to enforce whatever is agreed to. That's sort of the final step, right? There's sort of the what are we negotiating, the substance of it, and then the final step is going to be, do we think that the other party is actually going to comply with what's agreed to? So it's an incredibly relevant topic. I think is a great way to wrap up this discussion group. And so now to quote Jeb Bush, please clap.
Should end everything with